This is an ancient word, Ruth 1, 1 through 17. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, even if death parts me from you." And now a contemporary word, John O'Donohue, for friendship. There is an unfamiliar term in the poem Anam Cara, which means, quote, soul friend in Gaelic. For friendship, may you be blessed with good friends. May you learn to be a good friend to yourself. May you be able to journey to that place in your soul where there is great love, warmth, feeling, and forgiveness. May this change you. May it transfigure that which is negative, distant, or cold in you. May you be brought into the real passion, kinship, and affinity of belonging. May you treasure your friends. May you be good to them, and may you be there for them. May they bring you all the blessing, challenges, truth, and light that you need for your journey. May you never be isolated. May you always be in the gentle nest of belonging with your Anam Cara.
We heard just part of the first chapter of this story of Ruth and Naomi and Orpah today. Just part of it, and it only goes on for 4 chapters. So if you're inclined, it might be a good afternoon read if it stays so foggy like this. Yeah. So in our story, Ruth, Orpah, and Naomi are living, breathing, whole human beings, women caught in a desperate situation. As women in a patriarchal culture, without husbands or sons, They are completely vulnerable, economically, socially, culturally, politically. They have no choice but to act, and act they do. These three women came together by circumstance. First, Naomi moves with her husband, Elimelech, leaving their family home in Bethlehem, in Judah, near Jerusalem, seeking food during a famine. They find their way to Moab, which is across the Dead Sea. They had to go around one end or the other to get there. It's across the Dead Sea to the east. Naomi's husband Elimelech dies. Naomi grieves. Naomi grieves, but she still has her two sons, her source of security. Circumstances were tentative, but Naomi had a place. Two Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, marry Naomi's sons. Circumstances brings these three women together. But in 10 years of living together, they clearly become close, weeping when they part. Not just circumstances, but also choices made them friends, deep and committed friends. Their choices had made them family. They loved and depended on each other. Then their husbands, Naomi's sons, die. Now 3 widows grieve. Now Naomi has decided to act, to return to Bethlehem, to her extended family, where perhaps she can find a place to live. By custom, widowed daughters without children had an ambiguous place in the family. Formerly, they had no attachments. Naomi thought their best chance for a secure future lay in their own families, their families of origin. Orpah agreed and departed for her mother's house, as Naomi put it, though not without weeping. But Ruth vigorously insisted on staying with Naomi. We can't know her reasons. Perhaps she thought things would be even more difficult in her family's home. But here, we can clearly see her commitment to Naomi, as if she were Naomi's own unmarried daughter. Things could have proceeded in a much more difficult way for Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. If they truly had no family connections, they most likely would have ended up as slaves or even prostitutes. And that's why we see so many instructions in the Bible to take care of widows and orphans. Today we've just heard the very beginning of this story. And as I mentioned, it's only 4 chapters, so it's a good read for an afternoon. It's a very well-told story. It has intrigue and action, and it tells us a lot about conditions for women in those times. And it does have a happy ending, which I will spoil for you now. Ruth ends up marrying a member of Elimelech's family and giving birth to a son, Obed, who becomes the father of Jesse, who becomes the father of David. Yes, that David, who becomes king, the king who unites all 12 tribes into one nation. So this story, in addition to being a good story, plays an important role in the self-understanding of the Israelite nation. Now, in the background, there's a couple factors that a contemporary reader might not pick up. One is the question of intermarriage between the people of Judah, the Israelites, and other nations. The Bible is ambiguous here because in prophets Ezra and Nehemiah and in Deuteronomy, intermarriage is forbidden. But we can just look back through the stories of the history of Israel and we see Intermarriage, Abraham marries Keturah after Sarah's death. Joseph married the Egyptian Asenath. Moses married Midianite Zipporah. And then here, Boaz married Ruth from Moab, and she's the great-grandmother of King David. So intermarriage, one question, and another, the question of enmity between Israelites and Moabites. Last week we heard about Moses standing in Moab, looking out over the sea and over the promised land, giving his farewell speech. We didn't see difficulties there, and we didn't see difficulties in Moab for the Israelites here either. They seemed to be able to move back and forth with no issues. We know from written evidence that the Moabite and Israelite languages were very closely connected. And even in the stories of the Bible, the Moabites are also descended from Abraham. So there is a family connection here. And yet, not long after this story of Naomi and Ruth, Israel's first king Saul wages war against Moab, and later Moab gave refuge to David and his armies in their struggle against Saul. And perhaps the most devastating warfare between the two nations is told in the book of 2 Kings, during the time of the divided kingdoms of northern Israel and Judah. Israel and Judah set out to attack Moab. Terrible battles ensued. The invading armies destroyed many Moabite towns, threw stones in fertile fields, stopped up every spring, and felled the fruit trees. Recalling these stories, I can't help but think about the many wars raging today between related countries, even related people within one country, internal conflicts in Myanmar, Russia's war on Ukraine, war in Sudan, Ethiopia, between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, war in Colombia, Afghanistan, and perhaps most vividly now, this war between Israel and Palestine. There's no easy way to talk about this conflict. Just as the other conflicts I named, it did not originate this past week. We know that the Palestinians say it started in 1948 with what they call the Nakba, which was the movement of the newly arrived Israelis to push them off their land so that the Israelis could claim it. People in Gaza, they were pushed into Gaza, a place that had formerly counted 60 to 80,000 people, now had 200,000. At least 200,000 refugees, so we were almost 300,000 people here in a narrow strip of land, 140 square miles. And when this first happened, the refugees expected to return home. But it became clear that wouldn't happen. The tents turned into concrete buildings, ever higher, as the population today has grown to over 2 million people, at least 70% of whom are refugees. Indeed, Palestinians and their allies have long been sounding the alarm that Israel was subjecting Palestinians to a brutally violent apartheid regime with impunity, and that there would be terrible consequences if the international community failed to intervene. I mean, we can ask ourselves, how is this conflict presented to us in our news media? Would we know that the United Nations classifies the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory as unlawful under international law? Due to the permanence and the Israeli government's de facto annexation policies. Last week, CNN's Clarissa Ward was shown taking shelter from rockets, a white American journalist fleeing Palestinian terror. Do journalists taking coverage from Israeli terror receive the same empathetic coverage? Last year, Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian-American journalist, was killed while covering the West Bank. There's never been any justice for that killing. As I understand it, it was a sniper attack. And over the past 2 decades, Israeli forces are accused of killing 26 journalists, including at least 6 this week. Our hearts go out to all the people in this seemingly irresolvable situation. And we can remember numbers over the years. The United Nations says between January 2008 and September 2023, 308 Israelis were killed by Palestinian groups, 131 of them defense forces, the others civilians. And in that same period of time, 6,407 Palestinians were killed by the Israeli Defense Forces. It's almost 21 times the number of Israelis, and over 2,000 of them were women and children. Gazan infrastructure was destroyed as well. You've seen it, the bombing of hospitals and schools and houses. I was looking in our local papers this past week at comments by both Israelis and Palestinians living in this area. And both are devastated by these events, this new war, and yet responses have been quite different. One young Israeli who had been working in San Jose was home visiting family in Israel when this all started. Having served his 3 years required military service as a younger man, he went right back to the army to fight. He said, "There was no thought about it. If my brothers are fighting, I'm going to be fighting. The only thing that really matters now is to fight this war and make Hamas pay for what they did, and bring back the peace, and mainly the quiet, to all the citizens here in Israel." I can't help but think that he doesn't understand the lack of peace and quiet for Palestinian Israelis. And Palestinians flee. Some of them, Bay Area residents, are caught up in Gaza. They were home visiting family. Some are still here, trying to maintain contact when power has been cut off, internet disrupted. They're trying to mobilize. They've had demonstrations here, but the civilian population doesn't have many ways to respond here. I also heard of an Israeli man who was home visiting his family, and he immediately went to the relief agencies where he volunteers, bringing people supplies that they need. Many responses. I've read a number of Jewish commentators this week. Admittedly, those who are opposed to this war and the conditions under which Palestinians live. One of them, Ori Hanan Weisberg, who I hadn't met before, said, "Understanding something deeply and more broadly doesn't mean that one thinks it is just." And that is a piece of the challenge here, justice. He notes that Hamas's latest actions have undercut Palestinian efforts. Palestinians are again portrayed as warlike people seeking to destroy the people of Israel. And it makes it easier for Israel to say, it's not freedom that they're seeking, it's our destruction. He says there's no security and dignity for Israeli Jews and dignity without dignity and security for Palestinian Arabs. He's also angry at a global situation that has allowed this situation to develop in these ways. It's heartbreaking. Our hearts are broken for the Israeli people, for the Palestinian people, for the land, for the many people spread around the world because of this conflict, for the many people trapped in places where they cannot protect themselves. Well, perhaps we've strayed a bit from the story here, the story of Naomi and Orpah and Ruth. But perhaps not. There's a word that's used several times in this passage and several more times in the book of Ruth. And that word is hesed. Now, hesed is love, it's loyalty, it's faithfulness. It's more than an emotion or an attitude because it's something that you do. Hesed means taking great risks beyond what could reasonably be expected. Great risks to do what is needed. Ruth accompanies Naomi, devotes her life and action to caring for Naomi. When a human does hesed, it can be surprising, overwhelming, transformational. Now, hesed is realized through faithful, loyal, kind interactions among humans with each other. And this human hesed is a window into God's hesed, which is often translated steadfast love, and which is beyond anything that we can ask for or imagine. Naomi asks God to do what she cannot do, to bring about full lives for her daughters-in-law. That's part of what the Psalms are about, God's steadfast love to the faithful in times of distress. Rescue me, rescue us from illness, from enemies, from death. And the hesed of God is also found in God's forgiveness for human failings, human sin, something we humans continue to struggle with. Now, human chesed happens when human relationships are in good shape, good repair, when we have loving and kind relationships with each other. God's chesed can come when the covenant relationship is broken by unfaithfulness. God's chesed has a breadth and a depth beyond what humans are capable of, though we might aspire. Naomi and Orpah and Ruth found themselves in a desperate situation, and they chose life. And so do we, both in our own lives, like these three women, in our world, in relation to Israel and Palestine. May we choose life now. We need to do chesed now. Our denomination, the United Church of Christ, is part of an organization called Churches for Middle East Peace, and they steadily work for peace and justice in Israel and Palestine every day. They're part of coalitions with people of all faiths and no faith. Now they're calling us to join them, standing in the GAP, the gap. They ask us to give to organizations who are addressing systemic issues, responding to this humanitarian crisis, and to act, to call on the U.S. government and elected officials for an end to the violence, war, and the devastation of human life. And P, pray. Pray, that's like the Psalms. Set out the anguish and the impossibility of our situations. Pray. Give, act, pray, our response. A way of remembering who we are, of strengthening our commitments to love and justice and peace, to building up this beloved community as a home where we can do chesed. In closing, I'd like to share a prayer from Rabbi Alyssa Wise. She's responding to this moment. She's part of a group called the Jewish Voice for Peace. And here's her prayer. I love her names for God here, by the way. May the one who remembers allow us to hold in one hand 75 years of occupation, dispossession, and violence, and in the other, a future of peace, justice, and freedom. May the one who is slow to anger soften our hearts and our fists, helping us to put down the sword, even at the height of the arc of our rage. May the one of possibility remind us that a future of peace with justice is possible. May the one who awakens us to life hold us in our pain and vindictiveness until we set those down for the sake of life. May the one who endures allow us to act for the sake of the coming generations. And may the one who is without limit expand our senses of what is possible as we reach for justice, freedom, and peace for all. Amen.